Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. My name is Elly. I'm an activist against sexual exploitation in Germany. And today we're talking about homelessness and the so-called sex for rent phenomenon. And with me is Sybil Joe.
Hi, my name is Sybil Joe. I am an exited prostitution survivor of about 15 years. I've experienced homelessness within and outside of prostitution, and I'm really excited to talk to Elly today. She's got a lot of great ideas and bullet points for what's going on globally in the housing situation for women. Yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
I'm too. This has been grating my nerves for so long because the reality is every single time I look for a new place by myself as a single woman, there are dubious ads and proposals that come my way. We'll get into some of that. And when I tell people, they're often shocked that this is such a big thing. I think it's probably helpful for us to define what sex for rent is. So a very quick and rough definition of sex for rent arrangements is when a landlord, the most neutral way I can phrase that, is gaining sexual access to the tenant for reduced rent or not paying rent. And we'll go a little more into what that looks like. But actually, before we do that, it's helpful to look at what homelessness actually is, because it's not so straightforward. People always think about the most desperate form of it, which is people sleeping in the streets. But there is a lot more here. I've looked at some definitions and some criteria by big charities focused on this issue. And they say there's actually 3 different ways to look at housing to see if it's, humane. The first one is actually habitability. So you might have a home, but is it in a state that's humane? There's people stuck in buildings with severe mold problems, health hazards, right? Termites, leaking water situations that aren't getting fixed, broken appliances. So if that situation is really serious and you can barely live there, your situation might approach being defined as homelessness.
So basically the idea is like, what is it to be housed? What is it to be in a home? Where do we draw the line? Is it a home if it doesn't have a kitchen? Because there are a lot of people living in hotel rooms. A good friend of mine is on disability, and her entire disability check, $1,200 goes to her rent. Her entire check goes to her rent, and it's a hotel room. And it's like an extended stay kind of place. They rent to a lot of veterans. Most of the people there are on disability, and they don't have a kitchen. They have a hotel room, and that's their entire income. So do they have a home? Is that a home? Do we call that a home? This habitability thing, I've lived in places certainly that were legal for them to rent. They pass the very bare minimum standards, but like you said here in your notes, does it have mold? Does it have good heating? Is this actually a place where we as a society have decided people can live and function and thrive? That was really interesting to me. I have never heard anybody talk about it. So that was really validating for me.
Yeah, so for anyone listening, if that describes your home, you would really be, according to these, cross-country charities, at least be categorized as living precariously. But there's 2 other criteria. So if 2 of these are met, you would meet the criterion of homelessness. The second one is legal protection. So that is, do you have a legally binding, law-abiding, settled rental agreement? While reading this, I actually realized it's happened to me twice that I had a rental agreement that was at least dubious, and one was for sure illegal because me and my flatmates were kicked out, and they also kept our deposit, of course. I mean, who actually knows rental law, right? Especially if you're a migrant, a foreign student, or, regular people don't have legal knowledge mostly, and It's crazy what people do and what they get away with, because who has the time and energy to actually take someone to court, like for the deposit, obviously. If we had been like, well, you got to pay us back, well, the legal proceedings cost more, right?
Yeah.
And that's how they get away with it. There's a number of people right now who think they have a binding contract, and it's actually a sham contract.
Yeah, yeah. And there are also a lot of kind of handshake agreements. I think when you get to the lower end of the spectrum, the more vulnerable you are, the less legal protection there is, right? And you're just happy to land wherever you end up landing, happy to have someone who agrees to let you stay in their place. I think that happens a lot where there isn't even a contract.
So one of the dubious contracts that I've had, I mentioned, not only was I paying 500 euros a month for a basement room with a bath, but sharing the kitchen, I was also said I should babysit to earn my keep.
Mm-hmm.
And they did also kick me out because I didn't babysit enough. And they gave me 3 weeks notice, which I believe is under the legal limit. They technically have to give me more. And then I was just very lucky that I found another place. And also lucky that if it had been like super emergency, I could have couch surfed or I could have gone to my family. But still, like most of us don't sit down and like double check. If you're not a law student, you're not sitting down double checking if they're basically scamming you right now. I should mention this. There's something called housing cost overburden. And that is when the rent takes up more than 40% of a person's disposable income, which, by the way, disproportionately affects women because women still earn less than men across the globe.
Doing the same job, if a woman can even get that job. The wage gap statistics are off because we can say women get paid less for doing the same job, but you have to get that good job even to get paid 50 cents less. You know what I'm saying?
Even though it's true that we're now getting more degrees, this is not shown up in our earnings yet.
Yeah.
I think I was reading that there is more female home ownership. At the same time, there's been an increase in female homelessness and female precarious living the last years, especially since the pandemic. I will come back to that a bunch of times, I think. But just to mention the last criteria of homelessness, and that is social appropriateness. So, do you have privacy to bathe, to change your clothes, to rest? Do you have the ability to receive guests, which a lot of the student accommodation, we call it sardine living. I know a lot of people who have lived in situations that weren't really okay, but you're like, oh, you manage for a couple of years and you have your degree. Hopefully you can move on. But if I imagine that some of the student accommodation I lived in or I saw for other people, if we had to stay there, rooms that are so tiny, there's a bed and a desk, and that's kind of it. You can't receive people there. One anecdote, my dad, when he was a student, he lived in a room that was a walk-through room. So it had 2 doors and people would pass through, and he lived behind a curtain. That is not socially appropriate. Like now it's a funny anecdote, but I'm sure when he lived like that, it wasn't great. And if that is your permanent situation, that is a sign of precarity.
Like you said, a lot of people, myself included, don't have time to sit down and really be in the conversation, either legally or even socially, even knowing what, like you said, these charity groups or these kind of bigger organizations, how they're defining, how they're talking about homelessness. I spent a lot of years, I call it unstably housed. Since I lost my house going on 10 years ago, I got evicted. And I haven't had a place that was mine, and when you're talking about living behind a curtain, living in these shared spaces, living without privacy, living without running water, living without electricity, I've done all of it, but I still felt like I was having a pity party if I described myself as homeless. I only use that word when I'm talking to my close friends and they understand what's been going on and what the burden of that is. And seeing these different bullet points of if you have 2 of these, you are technically homeless. It was really validated. And I honestly, like, I cried and cried and cried when I read it because I think there are a lot of places where I am included where this is normal.
Yes.
There's a you want to call it underclass, or there's a group of people who just live this way, and we just accept it and we just say, hey, I'm too blessed to be stressed. I'm standing on my 2 feet, and that's what I'm grateful for. And we just move on and keep going. But habitability, legal protection, housing cost overburden, and socially appropriateness. Because if you're living in a way that is different than everybody else around you, you know it. And that has a social cost.
Yeah, like you can't receive guests. Like, how are you supposed to have a social? Like, if you have to hide that you can't have people over, or you can't have the friends of your kids over.
Trying to find a room for a single person is so expensive. And a lot of the ads that I've skipped over have said no guests.
No pets.
And I'm like, well, I have a family, I have kids, I've got a brother, I've got a little dog. This is my life. And there's not a place for it. And that changes the way you live. And it changes the way you interact with society. And I'd never seen it actually like laid out like that. I love having those 4 bullet points that say like humans need these things
Yeah.
to be able to have dignity and to be able to interface with society.
So this is EU specific, but in the literature, I came upon something called the Declaration on the European Platform on Combating Homelessness. So that's an agreement by the European Union to end homelessness by 2030, because being housed and having dignified housing is a human right. It sounds very ambitious now, especially since we keep mentioning things got worse with the pandemic, especially for women. But it starts with acknowledging that this is not okay, and we have to recognize there's a lot of invisible homelessness, and we shouldn't wait till people are literally on the street to do something. And so I just want to mention, just to make it a little bit more concrete, different types of homelessness. So yes, that includes people sleeping rough. It also includes people living in tents or cars. I know so many Americans who've lived in their cars for months or a year plus. Makeshift huts, basements.
When I saw basements, I hadn't thought of that as being I would love to rent a basement right now. It would be perfect for me. I guess I didn't think of that as inhumane housing.
So I have lived in a basement, but it was like renovated to be like a guest room. I mean, it was fairly cold in the winter, but it was manageable, and I had a bathroom, but still mold is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that was precarious, but it was dubious. And if I had nowhere else to go, it would have, at some point just been unacceptable. But like an unrenovated basement, no heating, all the mold is not humane. I think that's what they mean when they say basements. But just to continue the list, there's people in emergency accommodation, so one night only shelters. There's people living in, slightly longer stay, but still intended to be temporary homeless housing, hostels, hotels, and also women's shelters, which are often neglected in the statistics. So a lot of the reports said, actually, we don't know how many women are living in shelters. That's not really reliably tracked.
Fascinating.
So actually trying to track how many people are homeless, there's a big population left out. And then there's also people who stay in institutions that they're supposed to be let out of, like a prison or a psych ward, but they have nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And so they're kept on, which I guess is better than making people homeless, but it's not dignified or a solution, obviously, either. I have heard of that anecdotally, of people committing crimes because they needed a place to sleep.
Yeah.
And jail or prison is a roof over your head.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and be honest here and be really vulnerable and tell you, I've thought about it. I've thought about prison as a housing solution.
I'm so sorry.
It's fucked up.
And U.S. prisons are terrifying. I don't know. I hope the women's aren't as bad, but still. And then finally, a huge group, and this is especially for women. So women make up a really, really large group of those who live with family or friends, or also called couch surfers. Like, this is huge. And that's why we often think of the homelessness problem as male, because we see the men sleeping on the streets. But there's a lot of women so-called couch surfing, which that's not a great word, because that sounds like you're having fun, right?
Yeah,
and you're like, I'm sleeping at this place,
it's
and then
casual.
I'm going to go to that friend's house and we're going to have a slumber party.
Usually it involves domestic labor, like you mentioned. Usually what it is women are allowed to be in houses if they are servants in that house.
Yeah, it's not actually a free ride.
I've definitely done that. I've worked for people, quote unquote, worked for people in their house. And we'll get to that later when we talk about the Neil Gaiman situation and his tenant, and the way that if you have a domestic working situation, that's all off the books. That's not legalized. You do what the people who own the house want you to do. When we talk about women leaving a domestic abuse, we say, do they have a place to go? And I think what you're saying about, okay, there are more men on the street because it's better for them to live out on the street being free than to live inside someone's house being a servant.
Yeah.
But women don't have that. It's not safe for us to be out on the street. And so, it's kind of like better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. Better to stay in an abusive situation that's keeping me housed than to go out and face the world, which is full of predators. I think
And
that's really
so,
common. Really common.
yeah. So I found some statistics on what it's like for women sleeping rough. 50% report assault or rape. And I think that's an underestimation because we know if you ask women if they've been raped, most will say no. If you ask them if they've been, for example, penetrated against their will, a lot more will say yes. Right.
Yeah.
So we know that it's hard to call rape what it is. And so I think 50% is an underestimation. But let's say it is only 50%. If you have a 1 in 2 chance of being raped tonight, you're doing anything you can to avoid that. And that's why you're not seeing as many women on the street. It's not because they have great alternatives. They have slightly stronger social circles than men, but that isn't that much of a boon. Like we said, a lot of the women are essentially being exploited as servants rather than getting, good charity and community support. And I also found a statistic, this is Germany. Again, this might be even higher in other places, which said 13% of homeless women report having been trafficked. Again, I think that's higher because most women don't even know what the legal criteria of that are. But a 1 in 10 chance of a trafficker, finding you and abusing you, that's crazy high already. Another study from Canada and the US said among young people, I think that's usually like 18 to 20 something, the number who reported trafficking was 40%.
And again, all of these statistics are low. They're going to be low because the people who are experiencing the most are not talking.
Yes.
They don't have time to talk. They don't have energy to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of them are no longer with us is the harsh truth. Yeah.
Many of them. And women living in brothels.
Yes. So I added that. I didn't find that anywhere, but
yeah, nobody's talking about it. Yeah.
In Germany, that's not uncommon that you have live-in brothels. And so these are usually women who come from another country and they're like, well, I save money on the rent. Actually, legally, they're mandated in Germany now to have a room external to the brothel. That is an extra cost. So some just rent a post box. Actually, also means if they're not earning,
because that burden is on the woman, right?
She's like, if I have to pay the rent of the apartment and the rent at the brothel, and the brothel has a bed and a bathroom, and there's a pizzeria next door or a built-in buffet where I can get my breakfast. And then also it's great for the traffickers if they keep the women in one building. They don't want them to go anywhere else. And we have to consider how mobile everything is, how women will often change place to be, what the Johns call fresh meat. I'm sorry for the ugly language, but that is what it is called colloquially.
Yep.
Yeah, a lot of the women, if they're not making any money, they can't pay the brothel room rent. They don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah. You said that they're mandated to have an external room that's for them, but that burden is on the woman, right? That's not on the brothel. The brothel doesn't have to provide them with external housing. The women have to themselves, right?
Yeah. And you have to get a license in Germany. And if you want to get the so-called prostitute's license, then you need an address where they can send you like paperwork. And then it's supposed to protect you.
Yeah.
But it's like a Band-Aid that's, I think, doing more harm than good. And then there's the whole thing about during the pandemic where the women who lived the most precariously were recriminalized. We went back to prohibition, not just Germany, like all the countries that say we have legal or so-called decriminalized prostitution, they went back to prohibition. And if you were still so-called selling sex, you could be fined or even imprisoned. And that did happen. So we had prostitution survivors fundraising to get women out of jail. We should probably do a pandemic episode at some point and just go over what actually happened because it was a disaster. I don't think there was a single country that didn't end up just punishing women for trying to survive. When it should be so obvious, if during a pandemic at the start, we didn't know, there were a lot of people dying. Like I remember the mass graves in Italy, a lot of people fearing for their lives, fearing for their loved ones. If women are still in prostitution actively in that environment, that is proof that they're in distress. They're not taking advantage and trying to make a quick buck.
When I was in the sex work is work crowd, they would say, look at these places, they regulate it. These laws are there to protect the women. But what you're saying really shows, really illustrates these laws are not to protect the women. These laws are to protect the brothel owners, the pimps. And when the shit hits the fan, excuse my expression, the women are back to being whores.
Exactly.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
I would now move into what sex for rent is, because it helps to clarify that and to describe the environment it happens in. And so we both had the same experience, and we were both shocked that we were still shocked that when you Google sex for rent, what comes up? Porn, right? Literally, I was just Googling one more thing today. It said, landlord takes advantage of desperate tenant. That was
And
a porn
that's not
video.
a news line.
No.
That's not a news line. The Guardian isn't covering this.
Right? Or even The Sun or whatever. No, it's a porn video. And there was a bunch of those. So, whatever distress women are in, we know this happened with the various wars going on, the highly televised, publicized ones, just becomes a porn category. Any distress that women have becomes a porn category. And the next thing that I was thinking, actually, I don't like the term sex for rent. We'll probably put that as the title because it is the go-to term. It's even the one in the literature that the researchers and the politicians and the charities use. But that is coerced sexual activity. What do we call that? We call that rape. It is rape for rent. That is the more accurate description of what's going on.
Yeah. Yep. And I use that word. I was recently listening to the episode with Andrea and Mia, and they were talking about coming out. And Andrea said something along the lines of, in Canada, we don't have rape laws. We have sexual assault laws. Like rape is a colloquial term. It's not a legal term. And that's how I use it too, even though in the US we do have rape laws. When I say rape, I don't mean legally. I mean morally. I mean as a human. I mean, the kind of sexual assault that humans cannot live with. And I think you're right. I think it doesn't matter. I don't care what the laws say. Humans cannot live if they have to have sex to have a roof over their head. That's rape.
Yes. The reason that people prefer sex for rent, I think, is twofold. One, even the people working on this still have a discomfort with saying rape, or they're worried that people who will read their literature will be like, what do you mean rape? Come on. That's like when someone jumps out of a bush. This is about the feelings of people reading this material that are being protected. And then there's also the people who want to protect the men.
I was about to say, actually, it's about protecting perpetrators, because if we called everything that is rape, then a lot of men would be implicated.
Yes.
And the average listener, the average reader can't grasp that quite yet. I mean, and that's hard. It's hard to say like, oh, wow, my brother, my husband, my father, these things count.
We don't even have this listed here, but of course we have to acknowledge, and I'm sure we'll do an episode on the parallels between prostitution and marriage, how many women are not leaving an abusive marriage or relationship, and they are essentially in a rape for rent situation as well. And I think that is the real pandemic that is even bigger than what we're going to talk about here. And they overlap. There's connections. So if we, throughout this episode, don't go back to that all the time, we have it in mind. This is a huge, huge deal.
You're right. That deserves its own episode.
But strictly speaking, in the literature, the sex for rent, or we'd call it rape for rent, is committed by landlords, housing agents, right? So this is not just when you live there, but it's also when you're looking, and someone whose job it is to find you accommodation. They can be the predator, property managers, maintenance workers. I didn't even think about maintenance workers. Again, now that we're talking about it, porn, the first very explicit porn I ever saw was a guy fixing a woman's oven. And that is the stand-up porn trope, right? The handyman coming over.
Right, yeah.
But there are actually women whose stoves and washing machines don't work or mold removal or termite removal, like whatever, if you cannot afford that and then you get sexually harassed or out of desperation you offer that, it's still abuse. It's still unacceptable. And it falls under this whole phenomenon. So the predation includes sexual acts of all kind, touching, penetration, i.e. rape, but also asking for so-called sexting, explicit images. It's usually the case that the landlord or the maintenance worker threatens to evict or not fix whatever is broken if the victim refuses or tries to pull out. And this is also happening in a larger environment. So there was a UK study by an organization called Generation Rent. This is a study of over 1,000 people talking about inappropriate and predatory behavior. And it found that out of those roughly 1,000 people, 4% of respondents had been offered free or discounted rent in exchange for so-called sexual favors. 14% had experienced suggestive remarks, 12% comments on their body or appearance, 5% had messages of a sexual nature, 4% had been touched against their will. All these stats increase significantly, unsurprisingly, if you are female, low income, and are single. So it's actually a pro tip for women out there if you bring a male friend or just a friend to a viewing for your safety. That is a real consideration that women have to make because your chance of being predated on decreases significantly, which it shouldn't be. Like, what? Women can't even check out an apartment and feel safe.
Well, and
Crazy.
I would say out of those statistics, I don't love the numbers on any of this because it all looks arbitrary to me, to be honest. It all looks like really laughable.
I think this included the men. They didn't sex segregate these numbers, which is weird.
Right. Exactly. So the numbers are much, much higher. But even with those maybe kind of seemingly low 5%, that seems low. But those are the women who are reporting that the landlord made a come on to them. They made a harassing remark and then they refuted it and they didn't go along with it. What that landlord was doing was putting bait out. He was testing their boundaries. He would do that to every single prospective renter until he finds the one desperate enough.
Exactly.
It's not like, oh, well, there's some landlords who just sexually harass and that's all they do. No, they pick their victims. They test out ahead of time. Hey, will she smile if I make this inappropriate remark? Will she try to laugh it off? We were talking about the female dating strategy earlier, and I listened to their interview of Dr. Susan Verling. Anybody who doesn't know her, you need to go look her up, Dr. Susan Verling. If we could get her on this podcast, oh my gosh, she's one of my biggest heroes because she's brilliant the way that she puts together all of the different parts of the system. And one thing she said that really stuck with me was men are goal oriented. Men aren't stupid. We as women, I think a lot of times say like, oh, he just didn't understand. He just didn't know. No, he's just as smart as I am. I don't think that I'm a genius. I don't think I'm an extravagantly intelligent human being. I think I'm just a person. And I think that the average man is just as intelligent as I am. There's a purpose to these harassments. And like I said, they eventually will find the victim that is vulnerable enough. They're going fishing. Men like to go fishing. They're going fishing. So those small numbers of women who reported, oh, well, they just harassed me, and like your experiences, you were lucky and able to get away from that threat, but you saw it as a threat.
Yes.
And he's going to keep doing that.
As you're talking, I'm reminded of the pickup artists. And I think it was the infamous so-called pickup artist, and I believe he was later credibly accused of rape, Rouge V, who wrote in his books, he approaches like upwards of 100 women a month, and he gets maybe 2 or 3 to go home with him. So you would say, oh, that's a low success rate, but that's 2 or 3 women abused.
Yep. They do it because it works. They don't do these things kind of obliviously. We kind of project our own confusion onto them, I think, because this kind of perpetration makes us feel really confused.
Yeah.
And so we say like, oh, well, he seems really confused too. They're not. They do it because it works.
We'll go into that again with Neil Gaiman because that's such an illustrating case. But just to finish how this sort of predation, what form it takes, So even if she says no, there are multiple women in the reports on this who say, well, the would-be landlord that they were able to turn down, thankfully, it's not that rare that they will continue to pester and harass with phone calls, with cyber stalking, and some women even said they had those guys show up at their place of work. So even just meeting someone like that one time, if he gets fixated on you, can be dangerous.
Yeah.
Actually, I didn't take a lot of notes on this, but we should probably just pause for the women who end up in that situation, either knowing what they're getting into or half knowing or not knowing, what that is like to be at the mercy of that. So the women who did end up report things like the landlord just showing up in their space at all hours, including drunk or high. And even if they had like some kind of agreement, like, oh, okay, like 2 nights a month, which is bad enough. Like one time is unacceptable, but even if there were limits, the tendency is to not stick for that. Or they start off like, oh, just pictures and then maybe video. And then maybe, can we do that in person? Wearing down the boundaries over time, just like other types of abuse. They do all use the same playbook.
Because it's based on boundary violation. You have to keep moving the boundary and then violating it again.
Yes, I just want to say this is why like sex for rent is so inappropriate. If your alternative is, really precarious living or homelessness and you're stuck in this, it is torture. It is actual torture. We could say torture for rent, actually. Anyone who does the thought experiment, including the men out there listening, imagine like you could get a knock almost any time, or even if it's just twice a month, and you have to submit.
And that kind of always being available, that's part of it too. And Merle mentioned this when we were doing our sugaring episode about sugaring being a way that Johns try to get more access for less investment.
Mhm.
And I think sex for rent is another example of that. Just what you're saying. The fact that he can show up at any time means that your entire day is taken up by him because he might
Yes,
show up at any time.
exactly.
It's not just during the time that it happens. It becomes your entire existence.
This overlaps with the sugaring phenomenon because people often say, oh, the women who have a generous sugar daddy with like yachts and hotel rooms and 5-star meals, opera, whatever, they have the jackpot. But that includes weeks or months of being stuck. Or like the women who are literally the modern kept women. That is still a thing, right? Like the modern so-called concubines. There's lots of nicer ways to say what it really is. A golden cage is still a cage. I remember also on the female dating strategy, a woman who was a so-called sugar baby. One of the reasons she stuck it out longer was she couldn't afford healthy food, and she realized that when she was eating better, her health would be better. But then she paid for that in enduring sexual abuse of a very, very rich, powerful man for weeks or months. In case there's like any doubt, the women, whether it's called so-called sex for rent, so-called sugaring, that is severe trauma that stays with women.
We call it domestic abuse when it happens within marriage, right? We call it domestic abuse, and it's still domestic abuse.
Yeah.
When he owns the home and he owns you.
Yeah. And that was one thing. Some of the literature and the articles said, this is a new phenomenon. Like, why has this come up now? And both of us were like, what are you talking about? Ever since men have been dispossessing women, so thousands of years, this has been a thing. For the wives, the female servants, the slaves.
We want to put a new name on it so that we don't have to stop it. If we pretend like it's new, we can pretend like we don't know what to do.
I think it's good to stay on this topic just a little bit, the way that these landlords or other actors manage to reel women into this. So there's this big UK report that summarized how the predators approach this type of crime. There's 3 ways to go about it. The victims are either deceived, coerced, or compelled. So deception means, for instance, in an Irish report, they gave a lot of examples how these online ads look that the predatory landlords put out. This is like actual life advice for like every woman and young person listening out there. This is like no 100% guarantee, but here's some things you can look out for. So the typical ad will have absence of photographs of the property because they kind of know it's shady and they don't want to be reported. So they don't put a lot of information, including even stating the address.
If you're advertising a place to live, you'll tell people where they're going to live.
Exactly. So they can check out the neighborhood. How far is it to the next bus stop? Where is like the kindergarten, or where is the next grocery store, etc. So they will omit that usually. Then they will have no advertised rental price or a nominal fee. So like ridiculously tiny, like €1. Or it's really suspiciously low rent. It's like half or like 2/3 of what is the going rate for a place of that size. And they will often also state that they're looking for a female tenant. And they might even say they're looking for someone willing to do some work around the house, or even say looking for a submissive woman, which is about as direct as it will get. And they might even include a request, or once you reach out, they'll say, can you send a photograph of yourself or a physical description?
I know to avoid all of those ads, but I recently was looking for a room. Sometimes it'll be like an older man, elderly, looking for someone to help take care of the house. And he kind of presented himself as like a doddering old man. But then when I got there to do the interview, I realized immediately, oh, I see what you're looking for. And just like I was saying, like, you know, he dropped a couple little flirtatious comments to kind of test me out, because this isn't the first time he's done this. But the advertisement seemed very legit, and it seemed like an older person looking for in-home care or looking for some kind of help in that way. Which again, it's, you know, young women, especially domestic labor, we know we can do this. We know we can clean a house. We know we can take care of kids. We know we can take care of the elderly. And that's used to pull us in.
Yeah, so that's part of the deception. There might be no signs in the ad. There might not even be a sign the first time you encounter them. Some of it starts when you've moved in, which is, of course, when you're most vulnerable, when you've all your stuff there, and then it starts. So there's no foolproof way to 100% avoid this. Or like we mentioned, some of them only bring up the suggestion of sex with, you know, abuse when you're behind on rent. So you could have lived there 3 years, it was fine, and the moment they realize, now you're vulnerable, that's when they could make the move. So this is where I have some personal experience with this. Was my studies have all been in like pretty big cities with pretty terrible rental markets. So instead of looking for a home, there are websites where you can offer yourself as the tenant, and you get a lot of weird messages. That's where you do upload a photo and you tell your sex, your age, a little bit about you. And a lot of men just think this is a dating site. So I just had regular men, like not even landlords, be like, do you want to go out for a beer? So like men think everything is a dating site, right? But I also had prospective landlords say like, suspiciously low rent, but maybe, you know, we can get to know each other a little bit, which is quite forward, surprisingly forward actually for the situation. A lot of them do like a lot more coded language. And I've had multiple men say, there's only one bed. I hope that's okay. Like, you can take the bed. I'll be on the sofa. And the first time I looked for a place to stay, I think I sent messages to like 100 people before I found a place to stay, which was the one where I had to pay $500 and babysit. That was the best out of my options. When you're worn down and like either your job's going to start, in my case, my semester was going to start, rather than dismissing these kinds of offers, there's a part of you that wants to be like, oh, I hope this is okay. Like, it looks nice. It's in the inner city. Like, I just really wish this was a legit offer, and you spend a little more time than you should with these creepos, just in case it's legit.
There are good people out there, you know, and like I said about especially advertising for babysitting or elder care. First of all, they're looking for an empathetic person, right there. But also there are other people who are in need. There are other people who need childcare, who need elder care. And you think, oh, maybe we could be a good fit. Maybe these are good people. Like, I'm a good person and it's going to just work out, because that does exist somewhere. It's not unnatural to think that this could be a legitimate offer. I guess I have the tendency to think in retrospect, oh, I was so dumb. I should have seen that. But then the other part of you goes, well, I'm being cynical. You know, I should give people a chance.
And if you spend like weeks looking at housing that's like terrible, I was considering like moving into a place where they said, well, we're just going to play metal music really loudly a lot of hours of the day, which is already really shitty for like, how am I going to study under those circumstances? It's not the worst thing in the world, but when you see how bad the rental market is, like your boundaries for what you find acceptable, they get lower and lower. I was at another place where they had like weird sexist decoration in the kitchen. It was a mixed sex flat share. So like, if there's women there, it should be okay. But why do they have this like weird pony statue on their their fridge. Okay, maybe like it's not a place for me to talk about my politics, but maybe, you know, I'll live here half a year and then look for something else. When it's hard to find something, like your standards, they get lower and lower. And one of the creepiest situations that I accepted because I had already moved in was a place that had around the house multiple large dried pools of blood. It's insane. Like, to this day, I don't know what happened. It's a bigger story. I can't tell the whole anecdote now. We'll be talking for 20 minutes. But that was the place we got kicked out because it was illegal subletting. And clearly someone had been physically injured in there.
And they hadn't cleaned it up. The fact that they were so blasé about it, that they just expected that to be okay. And again, I find things like that to be like a test. It's a boundary test. If you'll accept this, will you accept something more?
Yes. I'm just telling this anecdote to explain when you've already moved in and all your stuff is there. I was looking at the other foreign students. We had one guy, he could only find temporary accommodation. He was sharing rooms with like half a dozen other people, like group emergency housing for students. In the Netherlands, they have students living in tents at the start of semester because there's such lack of housing. And then you're like, okay, there was blood in the apartment, but the landlord's like never around and okay price, it's okay distance to university. I'll take it over the tent and over sharing with 6 other people. So I can totally see how you've moved into an apartment, the landlord seemed all right, and then he starts being flirtatious. You push it away and you're like, it's not going to get that bad, right? It's like, I'll just be polite and like laugh it off and try to avoid him. And you start to manage situations that aren't actually acceptable. And if you had known that before, you might have not moved in. They know that. The landlords know that.
They know that. That's what I mean about the testing. Will you accept this? Oh, she will accept that. And it's like what do they say when you put a frog in cold water and you slowly turn the water up until it boils and the frog doesn't jump out because the temperature rise is so incremental. And that's how a lot of abuse works. I mean,
oh yeah, the standard in relationship abuse is this. I'll be a little disrespectful, and then during a sexual thing, I'll just cross our boundaries a little bit. Johns do that, same thing. And so just to illustrate, we're going to do a little role play just to read out a small interaction. This is a real interaction I had with a prospective Swedish landlord. So Sweden, the country of the Nordic model, still is plagued by this. It's like this is a problem everywhere. If one of the most egalitarian societies in the world has this issue, you know it's a really big one. All right, so we're just going to read out what a real interaction looked like. So here we go.
Hey, would you like to stay with me in the city center?
Hi, could you tell me more about your flat share? Where is it and how much is it and who else lives there? Greetings, Elly.
I live in a small apartment, about 40 square meters, by myself in a nice area of the city center. It doesn't have a separate bedroom, but there is one single bed. I'm easy with rent. 35,000, 4,000 KR with bills included. I don't know what KR is.
That's kroner. If you take 10 away, that's roughly the dollar amount.
Oh, okay. I'm 38-year-old single male. I'm a cancer scientist at the university.
Just to clarify, can you send me a layout of the apartment?
It's kind of like this. I draw it. The bedroom is separate from the sitting area by curtains.
And by saying there's one single bedroom, you mean let's share the bedroom, or am I misunderstanding?
Oh, no. It's a single bed. We cannot fit in that. You can take the bed.
I can furnish an unfurnished room, but I need a place with privacy. This arrangement still sounds to me like you're looking for a girlfriend, in which case I recommend traditional means.
Thanks for the suggestion. Let me know if you change your opinion.
Oh, it's so gross how he just made everything a joke, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and he was ready for your rejection. The way that he took your rejection so easily, like, okay, great. He's fishing.
Yeah.
I'm going to go fish somewhere else. I'm not going to get it here. I'm going to go get it somewhere else. It doesn't mean that he was shot down and like, oh no, now I can't have this beautiful woman in my one bed. You let him know that you were not an easy target and he moved on. And for most women, I think that's enough. They're like, oh, phew. Dodge the bullet, and then they forget about it, and they don't realize that this is what he's doing all the time.
We weren't able to read that out, but there's like smileys, like every other message he sends, there's a smiley, like haha, hello.
I tried to do it in my voice. Yeah, it's very smarmy, very he's very confident, like he thinks he's very charming.
Yes. The moment he said 38-year-old single male, I mean, I knew what was up, but I kind of wanted him to admit it. So I was like a little bit goading for him to say it. And I did report it to the university. I don't know if they did anything with it. They just said, thank you for your report. I don't know if they can identify him based on he's a cancer scientist. Probably not.
Yeah.
So probably nothing happened to him, but I tried to report him. And I would like did a reverse image search on his profile photo, unsuccessfully, unfortunately.
Good for you.
I was just thinking, what if someone accepted that? Even if he would actually be taking the sofa, which I have no reason to believe he actually would, maybe a couple of nights until he's worn the victim down. Just the fact that there's a curtain separating the bedroom, like even just knowing there's a guy room on the other side.
Yeah.
And even if you are separated by a curtain, you can't change. You can't have a phone call, nothing. This is clear. Like from the layout, this is an impossible way to live. Even for loving couples, I mean, a lot of people have to live that way because of the housing crisis. This is a little crowded. For two strangers, even if he's not overtly predating all the time, this is already a terrible setup. And he skirts around it, but we all know what he wanted to get out of this.
I think you said you were kind of trying to get him to confirm, like you knew what was up, but you kept going. I think he did confirm. I think the way in which he didn't argue with you, he didn't say like, oh no, he said, okay, thanks for your suggestion. Bye.
Yeah, he didn't even say, how dare you? I mean, some predators would be like, how dare you? It's not like there's any 100% way to clock them. They can pretend they're offended, but he isn't even. Yeah, he's way too blasé about it. He's way too chill.
Yeah. He knows what he's doing. He knows you know. He doesn't care that you know because he knows there's nothing you can do about it.
I should say I ended up paying, I think it was around 5,000 kroner, so around $500. Still a ton of money. That's what I paid for the illegal renting space with the blood. So
that's cheap where I'm at, though. I'm actually looking for a room for $500 to rent. The market has changed in the past 10 years. The market has massively changed.
But just to clarify, like the amount of money I would have saved if I had let myself be abused, which thankfully I wasn't in a situation where I had to consider that. If that was like a prostitution going rate, it's not a lot of money. Like,
which goes back to Merle's point about these cheap Johns, like sugaring, sex for rent. All of this is they're looking for a cheaper way to get prostitutes.
Yeah. So we said this is how they try to deceive you into it. Not super skillfully, but like we said, they just try it as many times as possible. And then what if I didn't speak English that well and I didn't pick up on some of the nuance, right? Or what if this is the first time I'm moving out and I'm moving out from a completely different culture. Maybe in my culture, sharing tight spaces is not that rare. And yeah, they really love targeting students, especially foreign students. I found one study that I wanted to mention from Ireland, which said among Irish international students, every 10th woman had been offered reduced rent in exchange for access to her body, in exchange for abuse. So we said the deception is one way. We talked about the coercion, but then there's a third way that's really important to talk about, and that is compelling someone into it, making the victim believe this arrangement is good for them. And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, our entire podcast is about this is being done en masse to women in regards to explicit prostitution, calling it sex work, saying this is like a career option, a fix for poverty, all those things. And so we see the connection between this so-called sex for rent and the sex work rhetoric because it is the same ideology at the base of it that says receiving something of monetary value, and Johns do also do like gifting or cars or travel
or sex for rent. I stayed with a John for a few months. I mean, his demands just it was overwhelming, and I went back to staying in hotel rooms. I was staying in extended stay hotel rooms, but I tried like, okay, this is a regular. We have pretty good, okay boundaries during our quote unquote sessions. He offered a place, and I mean, of course, it was what we know it is. I think you're right. The compelled category probably constitutes the majority of this going on because, like you said, the sex work is work rhetoric. If something is just in the culture, it's socially acceptable. If everybody says that something isn't harmful, you believe it's probably not harmful. That's the way humans work. We're social animals. And so, yeah, this sex work is work has much farther reaching than just the sex industry.
Completely. And we come back to this all the time. It's men saying, oh, I paid for the date. Why isn't she putting out? It's all the same mentality. I reduced her rent. Why isn't she putting out in the way I want her to? I paid for this brothel session. Why isn't she? Duh. It's all the same mentality. These are not separate. And so the thought experiment that I always offer these people is, okay, so if the landlord, instead of saying, can you sleep with me, said, are you getting evicted? Oh, the brothel's hiring. There's a job for you. You don't even need any qualifications. You're female. That's about it. There are male victims, but we know the majority are female. I can hook you up. Like, I know the brothel owner, like, he's got spot open right now, and then you can pay your rent. That would be sex work in the minds of those people. If you do the extra route through the brothel, what if the landlord shows up at the brothel? Is it sex work then? If he's your John, how does that thinking work?
I mean, it totally falls apart when you start looking at it. Like you said, they try to keep these things separate and say, like, oh, it's not okay for, we used to call it survival sex work, right? That's not okay. That's exploitative. I don't really know what they're saying. It's okay if you don't need money to survive, because like, what is money except what you use to survive? It's all survival sex work.
We promised we would talk about Neil Gaiman. And so there is a limited podcast series from Tortoise, which we're going to link, obviously, which goes into the allegations. These are allegations, but I feel like it's a very, very strong case for a predatory pattern. And it also has to do a lot with housing. There's so much to talk about here. Do you want to take it, Joe?
Yeah.
Give your thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely recommend the podcast. What is it called? Master?
Yes.
Because that's what he liked all of his girls to call him, was Master. I recommend the podcast. What I liked about it the most was that I think these sorts of things are not reported on very often. And I've read articles about the podcast saying like there was no legal actions. It's kind of a quote unquote gray area that most people don't want to touch because, you know, it's he said, she said, and it's a complicated relationship. But the tortoise went there and really exposed why these quote unquote gray situations aren't gray at all. It's actually very clear cut whether there's a legal action or not. Most of it had to do with age gap, you know, that 20 to 40-year age gap, but also relevant to what we're talking about now. I'm going to skip some of the podcast and go straight to Caroline, who was his tenant.
Yeah.
And she lived there with her husband and her 3 kids, 3 daughters, on Neil Gaiman's property. And they worked for them. Again, going back to the domestic labor.
Yes.
They were trading rent for working on the property. You know, apparently Amanda Palmer and Neil Gaiman weren't there very often. So they were keeping up with the grounds, picking people up from the airport, accommodating guests, you know, everything that goes into running a household. And they were doing that for 3 years. And she and her husband had a breakup. They don't go into the podcast what the circumstances of that breakup are, but when a 17-year-long marriage breaks up, there's something heavy there, right? There was some kind of heavy problems there. So she's in this incredibly vulnerable situation. Neil Gaiman swoops in and he says, "We support you. We see what he's doing. We're going to let him go."
He said, "I choose you," right? Like
I choose you. Yes. We choose you. like from on high. You're in, he's out. And of course, to her, that felt very valid. You know, she's in crisis. She said, you know, she was a wreck. She lost 20 pounds. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. I've been through that. That's PTSD. And you don't think the same way when you're in the middle of trauma as you do when you're on your own 2 feet. So when she was in this, he came in and started making advances to her. And the thing that really struck me, she's talking about it now I think she's 63 now. She was 55 at the time. This isn't just young women. Young women are very vulnerable to it. But even as we get older, when we're in a vulnerable time, you know, one of the things that she said was when he first started coming on to her, she thought he liked her. And she said to him, "What would Amanda say about this?" And he said, "About what?" And she said, "About this romance." He said, "What romance? This isn't a romance." She said that she was so embarrassed to come and talk about it because she felt like such a fool. She felt at first there was that intimate connection. And then he told her, no, there is no romance. And then he started bringing up, well, Amanda really wants the house back. But if you take care of me, I'll take care of you.
That sentence really
meant,
stuck with me. That's so creepy.
yeah.
So just
And
for
he said,
people who
oh,
don't know, sorry, Amanda Palmer was
yeah.
Neil Gaiman's wife, and she's also quite famous. We'll go into that.
Yeah. And there were other times that he said explicit things. I think that he did really like explicitly out himself with his victims, which of course, even the story that he gives to the public is incredibly damning.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
It's-
He's like, these were all consensual relationships. We should say he did very similar things to a woman who was his babysitter.
She was a live-in nanny. That was, again,
Yes.
her housing depended on him.
Another was a young fan, so that was a real pattern. And he says those were all consensual. So he downplays how extreme the sex acts were, while at the same time saying it was consensual for BDSM at other times. So there's a contradiction.
Mhm.
Oh, that's where we come in with a narrative about aftercare, where the guy who's a real sadist, like he wanted these women to call him master, he can also be sweet and cuddly and just wholesome and British. So the point I'm trying to make is he says these are all consensual relationships, but just from the setup, even if they are consensual, even let's say all these women really found him just adorable and lovely and sexy, how do you pull out when you're that dependent? Even if he was right and from the get-go this was wanted by the women, which they say it wasn't, or not, what he turned it into. The power differential is so insane, it should be illegal. With the tenant, that should be illegal. Well, we'll go later into what the laws are, but even if it's consensual, it's not okay because her ability to move out is so limited that it's, excuse me, fucked up.
Yeah.
So even his defensive narrative doesn't make him look good.
No. But I think the fact that he thinks it does is telling about our social narrative. The fact that he thinks that what he's saying is socially acceptable. And he's got his finger on the pulse. He knows what the public wants to hear. He's a brilliant author. He's a brilliant storyteller. He knows the stories people want to hear.
Yes.
And the fact that this is the story he's telling and he thinks that this story is going to fly. And honestly, Elly, I think it will. You and I talked about this before. Like right now he's laying low. I know that they've stopped production of this and that, but I'm willing to bet in the next couple of years, he's not going anywhere. I don't think his fan base is I think they're going to buy his story. I really do.
And the situation is, like they say in the podcast, it's hard to prosecute him for this. And that's why social shaming is all that's left to those victims. Yeah. There'll be people trying to find out who they are, dox them, harass them, make their life hell. That's what happens. That's what happened to the accusers of Andrew Tate. I want to believe the Neil Gaiman fans are not quite as bad, but even then just takes a few crazies to ruin your life, which
I don't believe that. Anonymous. I've hung out with them. I've slept with them. Like I said, I think he has his finger on the pulse of his fan base. I think he's representative. I think he's telling the story that they all carry.
And these are the left-wing people who believe that consent is king. Superficial consent is king.
Superficial, yeah.
You can have an age gap of whatever. You can have horrifically violent BDSM. You can have a level of dependency as long as everyone's over 18 and no one's dying. And then women superficially said yes, and they send them some messages saying, thank you for this gift or thank you for your attention or whatever. They're good. And that's how you also end up with this like crazy level of defense of the entire sexual exploitation industry, because superficial consent is king.
You cannot have sex work as work rhetoric without legitimizing sexual abuse, because there really is no difference. And in his refudiations of the allegations, basically he says, when I did this to them, when I told them that they had to be nice to me, quote unquote, nice to me, right? Like they had to continue this kind of interaction, then they were nice to me. How can I be responsible? They gave in. I tried it and it worked. Going back to that landlord who offered you something and you said, no, that's not for me. And he said, okay, thanks. See you later. I'm going to go on and try the next one and the next one and the next one until he finds one that does work. And then it's like, oh, she said yes. So then everything else is erased. All the other circumstances are off the table if she says yes. And that superficial consent, if we say that that's all that matters, then we greenlight any form of sexual abuse, because you can always find someone desperate enough to not fight you.
Yeah.
You can always find someone weak enough to not be able to fight you. If the only regulation is whether or not she said okay, that's what consent is, right? Consent is if she said okay.
Circumstances be damned. As long as everyone's over 18 and no one's dying instantly. That's basically the two criteria. Like I ask people sometimes, what's your limit? And I found it important that the journalists mentioned the law does not agree with this superficial consent is king stuff. In many countries, there are acts that are
Mm.
so violent that cause such obvious severe injury, you can't file them under kink and they're not legal. And actually, I think there's not enough of those protections. This one big campaign called We Can't Consent to This, I think they're also based in Britain. This was all around choking and how men were standing up in court saying, yeah, the woman died, but that was just a kink accident. There's good reasons why we include BDSM culture alongside all those other things. And it intersects with porn, it intersects with prostitution.
And I think it's really, really, really important for how sexual abuse works in the psyche for the victim. I think BDSM is a big key. Like I said, I was trying to focus on the tenant, Caroline, but Scarlett, the nanny who you had mentioned, she talked about the first time that he assaulted her. It came really out of the blue. It was very shocking to her. And she said, you know, he was saying all of these really nasty things to me. And he was talking in this way that was so unlike him. And that 180 flip in a person's demeanor is itself really shocking. These are tactics that can get a person into fight or flight or freeze, mostly freeze. One thing is that flipping of personality and those extreme acts. So when he first assaulted her, I hate having to fucking say, you know, to talk about it. She's talked about it, but I hate to have to talk about her this way. But he got in the bathtub and started anally penetrating her with his fingers. And that kind of extreme assault on the body can put you into this extreme freeze and fawn space where the chemicals that are going through your body, young girls think that when they're assaulted, they're going to feel afraid, they're going to feel angry, they're going to feel disgusted.
Yeah.
More likely, when you get that rush of adrenaline, you actually feel really clear and calm and curious. And then especially if you're a young person just learning about sexuality, you say like, well, maybe this is normal. And she kept saying that. She said, you know, when he got into the bathtub with her, when he was doing this, he was doing that, he was walking around naked. She kept asking herself, is this normal? I'm not sure. She was very young. Maybe this is what adults do.
This is what artistic nudist adults do.
Right. They're a little avant-garde, but maybe this is normal. And then she checks in with her own feelings. And okay, well, I'm not feeling disgusted. I'm not feeling terror. I'm feeling calm. I'm feeling curious. Young women, we don't tell them that it's very likely that when it's happening, you will get that, like I said, that feeling of clarity, that feeling of curiousness. And it's an energized feeling. And then you think, well, okay, part of me thinks maybe this is weird, but maybe that's just my hangups because I'm feeling okay. As long as I'm feeling okay, I guess this is okay. But we don't realize that that in and of itself is a trauma response. Feeling okay in a very extreme situation.
Because you don't want to show fear. You can't have your fight response happening right now. He's going to be stronger than you. He's trying to get through this.
And socially, you're trying to get through it because what am I going to say after this? What is our social relationship? What is my relationship with his girlfriend going to be like? What is my housing? All of that is going on at the same time.
Yes.
In making the decision in that split moment, how do I respond to this? And then some of us, like this is my trauma response. Okay, well, I'll just keep my cool and go along. And as long as things are okay and happy, and again, the fawning response, he will let you know if you give the right response, he'll be nice. Okay, he's being nice to me right now. I want that. I want him to be nice to me. So I'm going to be nice back. And it's all happening very, very fast. I didn't realize after listening to the podcast, their relationship, quote unquote relationship, it wasn't a sexual relationship. It was 3 weeks of abuse. And I'm so grateful that she was able to get away after that 3 weeks.
Because she had friends
sometimes,
who were really well versed on coercive control.
Yeah, she was able to see it for what it is. But I think a lot of times once you make those split decisions to go along, then you're in it. Then the decisions start getting heavier. Well, I've already made that decision. Well, it's on me too. I went along with it. And again, abusers know this. They do it because it works. So the BDSM, when your body is assaulted like that, your body goes into those responses. You don't think about it. You don't make a decision about whether or not your body does that. Anything that harms your body is going to put your body in that. They used to call it, because I used to be in the BDSM quote unquote community, they used to call it subspace.
Oh, I've never heard
guess
that
they probably
before.
still do. Yeah, subspace. It's the mental space that you go into as a submissive, which is, it's kind of how I just described, clear, curious, endorphins, and it's kind of floaty feeling. That's trauma.
And the thing that you expect to happen it will come later. It might come days or weeks or months later when it will really fully hit you.
For years. Yeah. I think that's a really important point. And oh, he said that about her. He said, gosh, he said again, his own words are the most damning thing in the whole
Yeah.
story, I feel like. He said something along the lines of within a few days of meeting her, she expressed a mild interest in BDSM or interest in mild BDSM or something like that. No, she didn't. That's not. He put little tests out there. He engaged her in seeing if that was something that was on her radar. You're not going to convince me that a 22-year-old went up to her 62-year-old employer and said, "Oh, I'm mildly interested in BDSM." No.
Mhm.
He was, again, testing and finding out if this was already something that she was groomed for. And just like Gildine says, the culture
Did a lot of the grooming for me.
grooms these girls. Yeah. And he was testing for that. He was looking for that.
And I want to mention Neil Gaiman is really, 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 really not an isolated case. I found it in the literature on so-called sex for rent. In an Irish study, it explicitly mentioned that BDSM scenarios of much older men abusing much younger women happens repeatedly, including to the point of incestuous fetishes like father-daughter abuse. And where once again, like at the start, we said, oh, sex for rent is a porn category. Every type of abuse that women go through is a porn category, is a fetish. And again, the consent is king culture tells us when it actually happens, it's kind of bad. But if it's just a fantasy being played out, it's okay. But then why are all these like severe predators so in love with this kink if it's so harmless and it can be compartmentalized? That's not making any sense. We're again being gaslit by the culture.
And the fantasy, the fantasy thing. And I think the Neil Gaiman is a great illustration because he's like the king of fantasy, right? Everything he does is about the inner world. I do wonder about men like him, how much they buy their own bullshit. I think they do believe what they're saying. They have compartmentalized in their own minds this idea of this is fantasy. Sexuality is about fantasy. That idea is really interesting to me. And I think it's a cultural moment that we're having right now where when we talk about sex, we're talking about fantasy for the most part.
People have
We're
to say
not
that
talking
about porn. It's not real. It's just a
human
fantasy.
beings. Yeah, but why is your sexuality about your fantasy? Sexuality is human bodies,
Yes.
right?
It's embodied. It should be when it's healthy.
It's people touching each other here in the real world. It's actually happening. That's what sex is. So when we talk about sex, we're just talking about fantasy. It's a dissociation, right? It's a separation from the body that they're looking for in their quote unquote partners, in their, I would say, victims. They want that woman to be disassociated from her body. They want to frame it as this is all just fantasy. It's all in your head. Your body isn't real during this moment. Only what's in your head is real. I think that's really relevant to this case. And like I said, in general, it's like a cultural moment in how we talk about sex and how we talk about sexuality as being a fantasy. And I think that in and of itself is dangerous.
I think what you just said is so important. I think that's really the key. But I just want to add on part of the abuse he did to his victims. I think one of the reasons people go for the fantasy is because a lot of it is happening online. His abuse also included sending explicit videos and images. I think that was his fan, Claire, who said it started out with like just slightly flirty, like messy haired selfies, and then escalated to like shower videos. And at some point he's masturbating in them. He did actually like later assault her. It is alleged, but compellingly alleged. I don't know if that's the right phrasing.
It became embodied. Well, it's not even alleged because he says he was on that tour bus with her. He disagrees that it was quote unquote assault, but he acknowledges that he did something. He calls it shitty behavior, but it became embodied. It went from the fantasy to the physical.
And still my point is, even if it had been only videos, those are still images and sounds seared into her mind that she has to live with. And that is definitely part of the abuse. That was not just the road to abuse, that was part of the abuse. So even when it's in the digital space and it's not so physical, that doesn't mean it's not serious. We know a lot of child sexual abuse happens today over the internet with live stream cams.
But that's not fantasy because the way it affects her body is real. Like you said, it comes into her eyes, it comes into her ears, and then her whole body responds. And that's real. She's real. Again, Dr. Gail Dines, she's always driving home the point, and I'm so grateful to her of saying, these are real women. that this is happening to. This is happening inside their bodies. They are not a fantasy. We've been talking about the BDSM, the grooming. These are the methods that are used. Again, looking at these women who need housing. The outcome is, if I don't perform in this way for him, I will be homeless. And the magnitude of that threat, and just really trying to drive home, like you said, there can't be consent in that kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess that's all. Let's talk about Amanda Palmer. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, last on our list about the Gaiman case is that he didn't do this alone. Well, we said he had the halo of his stardom, he had his entourage, but key to his entourage for many years was his girlfriend, then wife, in an open marriage, Amanda Palmer, who I actually was a fan of until I learned about this. I didn't agree with all her politics as a little liberal feminist, but I remember, for instance, once she had a nip slip during a concert or whatever, and she got shamed for it. And the next time she went for an interview, she just took off her clothes and was like, I don't care. And she's one of the few women in public life where I was like, I feel like she's actually not ashamed. And okay, that's not a recipe that tons of women can copy, but she was there with her armpit hair, and I know it's not the most important thing. And she was also making anti-rape songs. She made a very powerful song about Weinstein that I found moving. Some might argue a little more cosmetic, some of it a little deeper. I believe she has done like some charity work around that stuff as well. This is who she married, and they were like a power couple for a while. They did music together, they did charity together, they did all kinds of creative stuff together. And so when these young women came into their lives, it was often through Amanda. They met Amanda first, so they were also fans of her. And they were like, there's this feminist woman who even talks about violence against women. Oh, and Gaiman himself also kept like saying, I'm an ally, blah, blah, blah. So she made them feel safer. And I should mention this, one of the predatory landlords that approached me emphasized multiple times he had a live-in girlfriend. And that actually worked a little bit. At the end, I was still like, that rent makes no sense. Something's not right. But he emphasized multiple times, I have this girlfriend. She lives here too. So, if she's around, he's not going to approach me. And I stuck around a little longer for that conversation than I would have if he hadn't mentioned it. So I can totally see how it works. And if it was Amanda Palmer, doubly so.
Yeah, because of, like you said, what she stood for and what she. I feel so conflicted on this, because I was also a fan of hers, and in my mid-20s, that version of feminism, like that, like, fine, I'll just take off all my clothes. Fine, you can't shame me. And it is superficial, but it made sense to me at the time as a young person. And so part of me, like, I hear all of this and I think maybe there are situations from that time in my life that I can look back on and go, oh, I was party to abusive things happening, but I didn't know that it was abuse. It was also happening to me, and I thought that it was normal.
Yeah.
And now looking back as a 40-year-old woman, I'm going, oh my God, there were young women around me who were younger than me and looked up to me. And I led them into this situation with these predatory men. But then I remember, but she wasn't 25 when all of this happened. She was grown, established. And the thing that really put me over, I told you earlier in my debate, like, gosh, how do I feel about this? Was she an accomplice? Was she part of this? Was she also a victim? It was when Claire said that before she met Neil Gaiman, she met Amanda Palmer, and she hugged her and said, oh my gosh, I'm going to meet Neil in a couple of days. Is there anything you want me to tell him? And she said, tell him, I said, hi, Neil, but lean in like this and nibble his ear. And he's British. He'll pretend to be shy, but he'll love it. That to me was the clincher that solves my doubt about how much she knew. As far as I'm concerned, she handed these girls over to him. She was a procurer, I believe.
And I think we haven't mentioned it yet, where in the first episode, Scarlett confides in Amanda, and Amanda says there's been like 14 women who've said something about Neil that are
Which
not
is an
okay.
oddly specific number.
Yeah. She's been keeping tabs in her mind.
I was interested in that. What is that? 14 women who have come to her and said that this happened? Is that 14 times that she knows it's happened? I don't know. It's interesting to me to have that number. Like, what does that number represent for her?
Yeah.
14 times that she thinks he could get caught. You know what I mean? Because like you said, once you're close, if somebody's a predator, once you're in their inner circle, you see it. She saw it more than 14 times.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around, like, how do you live with yourself?
It's a lot of denial. Compartmentalization.
Mm.
Yeah.
Actually, Andrea and I, we will do an episode. You're welcome to join us if you want to, about women exploiting women and how that happens on the spectrum, where we have to acknowledge the victims of female predators.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, if they're female, it doesn't count. No, of course it counts.
Yeah.
But like you said, when it's the sea you swim in, and so you bring other girls to the party or whatever the scenario is, that's not the same thing as a, calculated madam or like a porn studio investor or whatever.
But the lines
Um,
are blurry. And I've heard
yeah.
Andrea talk about her experience with that and her regret. And I have not to that same level, but I have similar regrets in situations where it's a blurred line. Was I a facilitator in that situation, or was I an accomplice, or was I an abuser?
And then there's also the familiar survivor's guilt, where very often, like whatever the kind of abuse it was, it is usually for the individual actually not great to take the legal route and to go to court. That can hurt you more than it can help often. But then you live with, well, who is he doing it to today? And should I have? And they say that in the Tortoise podcast, that there's no glory and no fame and nothing in women coming forward. When women do this, it's because they're worried about others, and it takes so much courage and energy to do that. You don't even get that much resolution. It's more likely that your wounds get dig up again, right? They get reopened by the public scrutiny of your story.
Oh, yeah.
But you
And
do
picked
it to
apart.
protect others. And I know there's countless women who haven't done that because they can't, there would be too much retaliation. It's the better choice for them. But then you live with the guilt of, well, maybe the buck could have stopped at me. Maybe.
And on that point, Julia Hobsbawm was an old friend of Neil Gaiman's. She came on the podcast and told about a situation she had with him, 20, 30 years ago, and expresses regrets about just what you're saying. If I had said something then, would this have happened? Which, I mean, honestly, very likely. I think we overblow our own idea of our power in that situation when we have that kind of regret.
Yeah. With how the justice system works, if it even goes to court, if it even gets convicted, we can do whole episodes about that. Like, why don't women report their extra violent johns or their pimps? Because it could get you killed in the worst case scenario.
And nothing's going to happen unless you have really the platform, the support, and unless it's the time. Like, this story came out during this time after a buildup of different variables. If Julia Hobsbawm had come forward and said, like, oh, he groped me when we were in our early 20s, nobody cares. There has to be a buildup.
And I'm sure I haven't seen much of it, but I'm sure it's around where people are calling all the Gaiman victims gold diggers, because some of them did receive hush money, essentially, or like a donation to a charity, though I think that one actually didn't go through.
It wasn't, no, he didn't actually do that. He said he was going to donate to a charity and just did not. But even the money that he paid out, it was for therapy and housing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, the focus was on these women needed a place to stay.
Yes.
And yeah, they took his money so they would have a place to stay, because when you need a place to stay, you need it.
You'll take help from the devil.
Yeah.
We're nearing the end of the episode. And so, of course, the question always is, well, what can we do about this? And the first thing people go to, even though we just touched on it, incredibly imperfect for victims. But of course, there is the law. It's not irrelevant for the question of social standards. We do know that laws can have an impact if they're widely known. And if convictions are reported, they can have a normative impact. We have a list of a few countries and what the situation there is. And so my understanding is, under the Fair Housing Act in the US, abuse for rent is prohibited and it counts as discrimination. And I assume that would be usually based on sex, possibly also race. You would have to look at the individual cases to see how it's judged, but it's incredibly under-prosecuted, unsurprising. The severity is not sufficiently understood by law enforcement and other people involved in it. Meanwhile, I'm sure you heard about this, there's an increased criminalization of sleeping rough.
Oh, yeah.
You can prosecute some landlords, but you're not actually doing much to alleviate the underlying problem, then that's cosmetics.
I mean, really, as long as there is this, like you said, underlying problem, we can make as many laws as we want about what landlords say publicly.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Like, about what they advertise, about what they can get caught for. But again, when you're standing in that house with that man, what he says to you, it becomes he said, she said.
Yeah.
It seems to me, and I haven't looked into the laws as much as you have, but just looking at the notes of the different countries that you've outlined here, it seems like the US has maybe the least specific laws around this, saying that it's under the Housing Discrimination Act, it would be discrimination based on sex, race, familial status, national origin, etc. That seems to me like it'd be a really high bar
Yeah.
to prove.
Yes.
It would be really difficult to prove that somebody was discriminating based on one of these things, as opposed to if there were an explicit law that said if you offer rent for sex, that's illegal.
And that seems to be the case across countries. So even the ones that have banned it, it's quite recent. So in the UK, for instance, on paper, there's only been an explicit, distinct law about this since 2017. And as of 2022, only one man was ever convicted. I'm not going to go into all the details, but just to highlight one thing from the case, this is what his ad said. If you are a young girl, 16 plus, we can talk about age of consent in Germany, that would be 14, who is stuck at home and wants to get away, or maybe you are homeless seeking a safe route out, I have a room available in my home.
Seeking a safe route out. That's so explicit.
Johns love that Good Samaritan narrative.
Yeah. But what it really means is if you have no one to help you, if you are completely alone, completely vulnerable, come to me.
And like we said, that is exceptionally explicit. Most guys will not be that open, especially now that there is a law. So in the UK, 2023, they passed, as part of the Online Safety Act, explicit ads for this kind of abuse are illegal, and the platforms that host them, they can be fined. But these men, they develop coded language. They do it through Facebook. Most of the harassment I experienced was like on Facebook. There's no ad to prosecute. Facebook's not getting prosecuted. So that's pretty toothless, unfortunately. Then there are countries where it is illegal, sort of like Ireland, but it varies from different jurisdictions, and it's kind of subsumed under prostitution, but that requires that the victim who comes forward accepts that she's legally defined as a prostitute, which is a barrier to reporting, because there's already shame around this even if we don't use the word prostitution. Then there's a slightly better approach in Northern Ireland where it is not labeled as prostitution. It also doesn't require that money exchange hands. Any consideration in return for sexual acts, any commodification of sexual acts is illegalized, and you don't have to be legally categorized as being in prostitution. So that is better, though I didn't find any prosecution rates. I don't know if that's being implemented.
But then it says here it would not tackle the harassment of being offered these proposals in the event that they were not accepted. So again, you can only prosecute it once it fully happens.
Yes.
And the onus is on the victim of this extreme assault. These guys who are fishing, so you, Elly, you turned it down, so then you weren't a victim, but you can't do anything about his behavior, and he'll just go on to the next one. It's only up to the women who actually get raped. They're the only ones who can push for this prosecution, but of course, they're the ones who, for many reasons, can't. It's so frustrating.
So even among the best out of all the bad options we have is still markedly inadequate. And then what's pretty scary are Germany and the Netherlands, where it's not really clear what the law is. It's kind of sort of legal if you go about it smartly. I actually struggled to find exact legal explanation for Germany. A lot of the discussions on online boards, like imagine you're a woman trying to find out if what the landlord's doing is illegal. You Google that and all you have is like Reddit. There are housing rights organizations, but again, you got to know them. Because if I just Google sex for rent, again, porn comes up. Not here is how you can get help if this is happening to you. So it's not readily accessible.
Yeah, the onus is completely on the victim.
Yeah. But the Netherlands situation is pretty crazy. Actually, this was clarified by the Justice Minister, the Dutch Justice Minister, a couple years ago, was questioned in Parliament. And she said it is legal if you are a service provider, for instance, a driving instructor or a gardener. And here we go again to the handyman fixing, your mold situation or whatever. If that service provider offers the prospective client to pay in sex, so-called, instead of money, it is not considered prostitution, and it's legal. Prostitution is also legal, but this is not considered abuse. That's what the Justice Minister clarified.
Insane.
Yeah, sometimes you just like words. This is what the sex workers work mentality does. It's schizophrenic. It's not considered prostitution, but it is some kind of so-called transsexual sex, so it's fine. So this mentality absolutely has tendrils.
Yeah.
I couldn't find reliable information if you are the landlord, what you can and can't do. But again, like, why isn't this information readily available? It should be. And it should be a clear no. And the fact that it's tricky to find the information, that's part of the problem. I'm just thinking of one friend who is temporarily homeless. She isn't anymore, but has been precarity throughout her life. And she was staying in a hostel or hotel. And the taxi driver said to her he'd drive her to the place for free if he can come up to her room afterwards. And in the Netherlands, this is not considered harassment because he offered it to her. Somehow that makes it better. And if she had said yes, it would have been fine.
It's a free-for-all. It's a total free-for-all.
What's happening in Ireland is absolutely subpar, but it can always get worse. That's something depressing to keep in mind. And so there are no easy answers here. So yeah, it should be a specific serious criminal offense. There should be resources and training for anyone who encounters victims or potential victims. There should be big warnings on all the housing search platforms. There should be big social stigma on the perpetrators, not the victims. But we also have to fix the housing crisis, which we know if there was political will, we could. That's the depressing part. We know this wouldn't even have to be this dire.
But there won't be political will. It's so hard. The problems that we talk about on this podcast are so big that once you start unraveling one piece of the sweater, the whole society will become unraveled.
Yeah.
Like, really, our society is built on prostitution. We're not going to deal with prostitution until we deal with homelessness. The powers that be aren't going to do that. It'll be just like it's always been, just like resistance has always been a grassroots. It's going to come from the people. You know, when you say political will, that means individuals, that means groups, that means us, that means the conversations that we're having. It's not going to be a top-down solution.
Yeah. And there are things that people can do in their community. So really throughout the literature and just talking to women, like, we know we need female specific services. Women, they will not use mixed sex accommodations. Understandably so. It's crazy that we even have to explain that. If it doesn't accommodate children, they won't use it. Why is this even a discussion? We need to look at the situation for female foreign students specifically, for migrants, for the women fleeing the different kinds of war happening. Every homeless person deserves dignified housing regardless of why it happened or where they're at now, but it's often painted as a male issue. And that's what we can do. We can look in our own community. What is our shelter situation? What's our women's shelters situation? What are our trauma services?
And I tell young women, any young woman I come into contact with, if it ever like comes up, like, get your housing straight and
Yes.
live with other women. Don't live with your boyfriend. Get an apartment with your friend, and then your boyfriend can come and visit. Find stable housing that isn't connected to your sexuality in any way. I think that's really important for young women to realize.
And then when you're stable, you might be able to help out others. We will put links to everything we've mentioned in the description, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. We might do homelessness part 2. We will look at the pandemic. There's always more.
I have a friend, actually, I wanted to mention this whole topic made me think of her, and we grew up in the same neighborhood together. She lives a few states away now, and she's been living rough. She's been on the streets for a little while. She's actually been doing Facebook Lives, just walking around her town, like telling people what it's like to be homeless and the way people treat you and the way the authorities respond to you. And I thought about approaching her and seeing if she would do a little interview with me or something, just as a add-on to this episode, I guess.
Of course, if she wants to. And I wish we could do more than talk and offer a platform. Like, I wish we had tons of resources. Right now, this is just the mic. We actually didn't manage to go into that in detail. We can put some hotlines in the description for people in housing crisis, but as you've described to me, you're doing a lot of phone calls with basically no results. Like, the system is so overburdened, underfunded, and broken that if we give a hotline now, we can't promise there'll be help on the other end.
Yeah.
There's like no very hopeful point to end on here. That's the harsh reality. And for a lot of people, until they're in crisis, they don't realize how inadequate the safety net is, how severely inadequate, basically across the globe. Even in a place like Sweden, the social contract's pretty broken, if it ever was solid.
Mhm. And I think just, like you say, women who haven't experienced this level of precarity, I hope that they can listen and kind of widen their ideas about what's going on in the world and the way that things work. Because the way that, your life might not be precarious, your life might be very stable, but is it built on other women's precarity? Probably. The services that you receive, do you have a housekeeper? Do you go get your nails done? Whatever it is in your life, like it's touching your life in some way. And if you open your eyes and yeah, it's there. And I get what you're saying about like wishing we had more than a microphone to offer people, but at the same time, that microphone could be huge if it can reach the women who don't know
Yeah.
that this is what's happening. That's important to me.
I think that's a good point to end on. So thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the episode and who's able to process this and take it to heart and, maybe share it with others, talk about it. Because like we said, everything is closer to home being the poignant word here than we think. And we're all in this together, or we should be. We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.